Thanks for being here for another Todd Talk. We take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. What we're going to be discussing today is the idea of differentiating up. So, of course, before we can talk about differentiating up, we have to have a general understanding of what differentiation is in the first place. So, according to Carol Ann Tomlinson, differentiation is simply meeting the learning needs of a particular student. So you have some students in your classroom that might have these learning needs and you need to address those. You may have others that have these learning needs and you need to address those. So typically what we do is we have a classroom that looks sort of like this, where we have 4 different types of students in our classroom. Student number 1 is confused. They are having trouble understanding. They're not able to keep up with what is being taught. You have student number 2. They're a little more confident, but they still have some doubts. And so they occasionally have some questions. They occasionally need some guidance in what is going on because there's still some things they're not quite getting. Then you have student 3. This is the student that gets it. This is the student that has mastered what is being asked to be taught. They get it. They're able to apply then what is learned as a result. And then there's student 4. This is the independent student. And not only do they know what they're doing, they want to take it further. They're able to expand upon what has been learned. So they're not just applying it, they're able to take it to higher levels of thinking. Now, in a classroom, a lot of times we are addressing the middle. This is the student number 3, because that's where the content standard usually lays. And so we want to make sure that we address that need. But then we have to differentiate down and differentiate up. So differentiating down means for these students down here who might be struggling, either because they're special ed or RTI, or maybe they're just struggling with the concept. We need to scaffold up. We need to give them supports. We need to give them the guidance to help them get to where we want them to get in the mastery. On the other end of the spectrum, though, is where we differentiate up. So this student that not only has mastery, but is willing to explore it further, what do we have in place for this student? A lot of times, this is a gifted student, but not all the time. This is any student who's ready to handle the next thing that you're asking them to do. Oftentimes, we overlook this student. We figure once students get it, then we're fine. But what about that student at the other end of the spectrum who needs to be differentiated up? What can we specifically do in order to differentiate up? So there are 3 places typically that you can differentiate. One is you can differentiate in the content, you can differentiate in the product, you can differentiate in the process. So I'm going to talk about each of these individually and give you some examples at an elementary level, middle school level, and a high school level so you can see what these look like. But let me give you a basic definition for each of them. So when we're looking at content, so we're going to use a bicycle as our example here. If we are trying to teach students about bikes, and we're starting with content, we're going to start with the what. What is a bike? What are the different parts of a bike? So that we're looking at the what, being able to identify that, the content of what you're being asked to do. When it comes to process in the bike, you're looking at how does the bike work? So so we have all these pieces and parts, but once we get things in motion, how are we asking students to learn? How do we want them to understand it? And then our final area is a product. So once students understand what a bike is and how it works, then we want them to get to a certain place. So this is where will they be able to take what they have learned. So we set a finish line for them, so to speak, and they go to that finish line. But what if we could push this finish line further, or push it even further, because the student is capable of handling this type of challenge? Content, again, is what you're asking students to learn, but also what level should they be learning it? So when we look at the content standards, the Common Core content standards, there is a what, there is a noun within that content standard, which is what we're supposed to be teaching. But there's also a verb, and this is at what level should we be teaching it? So should we be teaching it at a basic level? Should we be teaching it at an application level? Should we be teaching at an evaluation level? So we need to take a look at these content standards and understand what is the bare minimum I need to get students to. And then we can decide how we're going to differentiate up. So some examples of differentiating content specifically is providing more challenging reading materials. So say you're reading about black holes and you have some students that are struggling readers, well, you might give them a very simple article, but you have other students that are advanced readers, and you might give them, and even though it's a middle school class, you may give them a high school or even college level article for them to read through. You're not giving one more than another. You're just giving them differentiation, different reading materials. You want to focus on the big picture. So sometimes in education, we break things down into so many small pieces that they don't see how they go back together and how it fits into this big picture. Math is a really good example of this. We learn how to do all these pieces and parts of math, but we don't necessarily know how to put it all together at times. So how do we focus on this big picture? Next is study problems that don't have an answer. In school, we tend to want to have students work on things that have a clear, definitive answer. But we know in life, this is not the way that things work. In real life, there's not an answer. It's very, this could be that, could be whatever. And there's not one that's necessarily definitively right and definitively wrong. There might be different levels of that, depending upon the situation. So we need to study problems to allow students to do that. We also want to give students that are topics that they're interested in or that's relevant to them. Sometimes they won't see the relevance. Maybe they're too young or they don't understand. And so we do have to help them see how the world works. And more importantly, we need to be able to say, this is why this content's important. This is where you will use this in your life. So this is what we want to get students to. So let me give you some examples at each level. So at the elementary level, what differentiation of content might look like is like you see here, which is these learning centers. So a student comes to this learning center and there's a big idea you see right in the center there. Numbers are everywhere. And then you have these 4 tasks. Now, the way this learning center is set up is all students don't start at 1 and work their way up to 4. Some students may start at task number 3 because the other 2 they already understand. Some may have to start at 1 because they don't have any understanding of what the concept is being asked of them. So students get to enter in wherever they feel like it would be beneficial for them. And they can work their way up, but some students may stop at task number 2 because it shows mastery and they don't need to push any further. So a learning center such as this allows students to differentiate how they're going. I mean, they're all still learning this big idea, but at what level they're learning it may be different. And maybe task number 2 is where the content standard stops, but we may want to take them to task 3 or task 4 to push that even further or to differentiate up. Here's another example. This is at the middle school level. So let's say that we're asking students to do a book, and the theme of the book is self-identity. Well, do we have to all read the same book? I think a lot of times in schools we feel like, yes, everyone in the class has to be reading the same book at the same pace so that we can have these conversations and so that we can make sure that everyone's reading it. But this is a good way to kill the love of reading because we're slowing students down or we're not giving them choice. So what if instead, in teaching self-identity, you gave them a choice between 3 books? One is Wonder, which is about a child that has a disfigurement in his face and how he's treated. We have Catcher in the Rye, who's a young man who is kind of at a crossroads in his life where he's trying to figure out where to go in his life. And then we have Little Women, a classic book, which is written at a higher level. And you see these numbers here, and these numbers are their Lexile levels. So Wonder is an easier read than Little Women. They both teach self-identity, so it doesn't matter which one they read. And it may not even be setting up for their Lexile level. It just may be which one is most interesting. So Little Women is a book that girls are going to like a lot more than boys. Similarly, Catcher in the Rye is one that the boys will like a lot more than girls. So we've given them choice in what their content is going to be. At the high school level, we might have something like this. This is when I talked about having real world problems or problems that don't have one clear solution. This was an actual challenge that NASA had put out. Whereas there's a lot of things that NASA has really figured out, but one they have not is how to use the restroom in space in a convenient way. And so what they did was they put out this challenge, and they gave the parameters of the challenge, which you can see right here. And they asked people to come up with a solution. What would your toilet look like? How would it work? Here are all the parameters of that. And so they sent this out to engineers, and they sent it out to high school students. And they had them, see what they came up with. And in each group, they eventually awarded a winner in this. And they're going to use this particular winner on the next flight into space once they design it. Process is the next one. And process, as we said before, is how they're doing the learning. But you need to ask yourself, is there more than one way to learn what you're asking them to learn? And math class will often say, this is the way to do it, but are there multiple ways to do that? We may say in language arts class, it needs to be written like this, but we have 30 different students who have 30 different ways to approach this. So we want to get away from the teacher-directed process and give students more choice when it comes to their process for learning, with guidance from the teacher. So here's some examples of how you can differentiate process. You can allow for flexible groupings of students. In other words, today you're working with these students, and so you group the students like this based upon a pre-assessment that you gave. But then next week, when you're trying something different and you pre-assessed, you may group them completely different, because the data has shown that these people need some help, these people have it, these people are ready to be challenged. And so we can group them, and then they're learning within that group. We can encourage creativity, and we want students to take risks, because that's where the greatest learning takes place. If we can get students to take risks, then they are going to be learning from their mistakes rather than avoiding their mistakes. We shouldn't teach kids to avoid mistakes. We should teach them to embrace them and to learn from them. We also need to provide opportunities for divergent thinking, which is, many different ways to look at something rather than a single best answer. And then we also need to explicitly teach skills that help students, these executive functioning skills that teach kids how to learn independently. If we want them to be independent learners, we need to show them how. We can't just expect them to know that. Even if they're ready to go to the next level, do they have the ability to organize themselves? Do they have the ability to persevere? Do they have the skills of being able to manage their time? So at the elementary level, what this might look like is specifically teaching executive functioning skills. So if we're asking students to focus and to pay attention, are we giving them strategies for what that looks like and how to go about doing that? So we might give them a project such as this, Dinosaurs on Trial. And during this, they're going to be doing a lot of the executive functioning skills. They have to plan, they have to organize, they have to task and initiate the task, they have to persevere, they have to focus. All sorts of executive functioning skills can be taught through project-based learning. And so students working on this project is going to allow them to put their executive functioning skills into play. And if you get a good idea of where they're at and where you may need to support, or if a student already has that executive functioning skill, let them go with it and don't get in their way. Okay, so why these executive functioning skills are so important, because when you look at what employers are looking for people coming to the workforce, they're these very things. Being able to work in the team, being able to write, being able to problem solve, being able to be flexible. These are all executive functioning skills. At the middle school level, what this might look like is having students, do what's called a skills inventory sheet, where they determine, here are my skills and here's where I place on these. Now, when I'm in a group, how can I put these skills to use? And if I lack these skills, how can I learn from others? And so I use those with students. I give this student skills inventory to them at the very beginning of the year, about a quarter of the way through the year, and then a little bit later as well, because this might change as they develop more skills. And so then I take these skills when I go to group them. So this is for flexible grouping. Let's say I have a project that's going to involve technology. Well, I don't want to put all my technology people in one group. So I'll sort my spreadsheet here, and I see where all my technological kids are, and I'm going to split them up. So each one will be in a different group. so that we are spreading the wealth and they can teach others their skill of technology. At the high school level, we might be doing what's called problem-based learning. And problem-based learning is looking at real-world problems that are kind of messy. And so this falls under this umbrella of inquiry learning, where we have problem-based learning is smack dab in the middle, where we're looking at the process of how to learn. And so what we want to do is give them problems that cannot be easily solved. We present this problem, or they look up the problem, or they determine the problem for themselves. They list what they do know. They figure out what they need to know and develop a problem statement. So how are you going to go about solving this problem? They're going to list what's needed and ask what questions need to be answered. They're going to do research. They're going to hypothesize. They're going to come up with a plan of action to try to solve this problem. And then they're going to present their solution. And more importantly, they're going to support what it is what they arrived at. What is the evidence that says that this is going to be better than this? And so in order for this to work, we need to give students problems that don't have an easy answer. So we need to give them these big, hairy problems. These are problems that don't have a clear right or wrong answer. It could break off into all sorts of things. So if you start with one problem in your classroom, you may have 6 groups all trying to solve different aspects of that problem. It can be taken from many different perspectives and angles. So it might be the problem may be solved by this if you're in this situation. But if you're in this situation, you may have to take this approach. So there are many different ways and angles and perspectives to think about. It is important that it's researchable. So you can't give them like a problem like, is there life on other planets? We don't have any research to back that up either way. And so it needs to be something that they can do some research on. And it's perfectly okay to give them a problem that can't be solved. So if you ask students to solve world hunger, students are not going to be able to do that. They'll come up with all sorts of strategies. They'll come up with all sorts of ideas. They'll come up with all sorts of ways to go about that, but they are not going to solve that problem. They're going to help with it, but they're not going to solve it. And so here are some big, hairy problems in general that may crop up that you could use as the basis for an inquiry-based learning project or a problem-based learning. The second one I want to talk about, here's an example, by the way. And so this is the standard. Understand that statistics can be used to gain information about a population. Okay, it's a math standard. However, how can we put that into a problem-based learning? So what we can do is have them do this. Look at the last election in our city for city council. Identify a population that was underrepresented in the voting. How can we then get them to be motivated to vote in the next election? So this is very real world. Not an easy solution. This is something that has perplexed people for many, 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 many years. They've been trying to get disenfranchised voters to vote or underrepresented people to vote. So how could they go about doing this? The second thing I want to, the idea of differentiation is in product. And of course, this is what can students actually produce that demonstrates mastery. And sometimes, does it demonstrate beyond mastery? Now, a lot of times the teacher is the one that is choosing the products, but what I want you to consider is what if we allowed students some say so in these products? So here's some examples of differentiated products, giving them a variety of acceptable products. So in the social studies class, if kids are giving you information and they're not strong writers, but they're strong speakers, do they have to write their answers? Could they do a wee video? Could they do record something, audio, like a podcast or something, where they don't have to write? Why do they have to write it unless that's the skill that's being evaluated? We want to make sure that students are involved in the scoring guide. So when we create our rubric or how we're going to evaluate it, how involved is the student? What part of the process are they involved in? Do they have any say-so? We want to make sure that we assign authentic tasks for real audiences, because this is what makes it relevant, and this is what makes students care about the product. So if they're actually producing something that's not going to get just hung on a fridge or not just thrown in a waste paper basket, but it's something that could actually be used, it's going to encourage them to try to step up their game. We also want to match the product to the outcomes being met. So if we have a content standard that asks students to physically do something, then they should be physically creating something rather than answering multiple choice questions. So what this looks like in an elementary classroom is We could use student design rubrics. I used to teach my third and fourth graders how to make rubrics because they were all working on different independent projects, and I didn't have enough rubrics. I would be creating rubrics the entire time. So part of the process of their learning when they're setting up their project is to create the rubric that goes with that. And so the reason why you want to do this and how you do this is you make sure, and they have lots of stories that they bring to the table. They're usually tougher on themselves than what you would be. It provides ownership. It allows them to say, okay, this is how I'm being evaluated. I was the one who said this. I always marvel when kids are like, well, that's not fair. And I'm like, you're the one who created the rubric. You did this for yourself. It makes them clear the expectations because they're the ones who came up with the expectations. It shows them the process that as you go through as the teacher. But keep in mind, when it comes to these rubrics, you will give them some guidance. They won't know how to make them. So you'll have to give them some guidance. So I used to train my students how to make rubrics. And so sometimes though, I did want to have some control. So I might create one of the categories myself and make that a requirement for all rubrics. And then they created the other aspects. So maybe responsibility is a skill I'm wanting them to learn. So I'll make that one of the categories of the rubric, and then they can create other categories that evaluate what they learn. So what this might look like in a middle school classroom is like giving them a choice board such as this. Where students can go and they're like, okay, I've got to do these different levels and I have choices. I can do the top, I can do the bottom. I'm still learning the same thing. I'm still learning a mastery or application or taking the next level or so on and so forth, but they're getting a choice between things. They have some say so. At the high school level, what this might look like is like you see here, this project-based learning. And this is an authentic product. So students are not just creating a product, literally a product, and then just presenting it to the class. You invite in an authentic audience that comes in. So this is the presenting to the sharks. So I would invite local business people from our community to come in and act as the sharks. And they would ask really good questions that were real world questions that maybe the students had not considered before. And so they were getting an understanding. This is how this works into the real world. This is the difference between theory and practice. And so it was important for them to understand that. So I gave as many opportunities as possible for students to present in an authentic audience with an authentic product. So there are lots of strategies that you can use when differentiating up. Some of the ones that you see are listed here. So you can use pre-assessment. You not have a ceiling on the learning where you can push them there's no stopping. They can go as far as they want to go. There's allowing them to work at their own pace. We often tell kids to dig deeper, but what does that look like? If a student is at a 5th grade reading level, but they're a 3rd grader, do we allow them to read 5th grade reading material? Do we go above grade level? You've seen lots of instances of student choice. Are we giving students choice in what it is that they're learning, how they're learning, and where they take it? Performance assessments are, again, another form of choice. Okay, can they show us what they learned by doing this? Can they show it by doing this? Does it have to be one? Does every student need to be doing the same assessment? Or is it just important that they're able to show mastery in whatever assessment they choose to use? Using a mentor. So sometimes as the teacher, we don't have all the answers. So can we bring in an expert to work with the student to push their thinking even further? Utilizing Blooms. So Blooms is all about levels of thinking. There are lower level thinking of Blooms, which are understanding, remembering, and application. And then there's the higher level, which is evaluation and creating and analysis. So can we get them to those higher levels if we're differentiating up? And lastly, as you've seen in many instances, project-based learning is a good way to take that ceiling off the learning and allow kids to take it as far as they want to. This was a strategy that I used in my classroom all the time to differentiate up. So if you want to know more about these strategies, I've created videos for each one of these on the Todd Talks page. So you can go to that and you can watch these videos where I go into much more depth on these. So let's review some concepts before we close for the day. So differentiating up means providing choices or opportunities for high ability students to be challenged. Doesn't have to be gifted students. Could be any student that's ready for the challenge. We can differentiate the content, which is the what they're learning. We can differentiate the process, which is how they're learning it. We can differentiate the product, which is where they end up with it. Where are they able to take it? We want to be able to offer them many different possibilities for strategies. So you have to figure out which strategy is going to work best. If we want to challenge our students by differentiating up, what strategy is going to be best? Which one is going to allow us to do that? And then finally, we've got to make sure that we take these theories and we put them into practice. We use them in our classroom. We show students how to do them so they can actually do what we're asking them to. As a reminder, as always, you can always check out other Todd Talks. Like I said, the 10 strategies that I talked about very briefly go into much more detail on the Todd Talks page on thegiftedguide.com. So feel free to look at those. There's over 100 videos on this page that talk about various things in education. So feel free to use those at your own disposal.